that most likely makes you acting chair for this meeting. So you might have to help out with the approval of the minutes, etc. But yeah, just hope everybody's doing all right. Just wanted to touch base, on whether folks are having any difficulties with the meeting materials or have any questions before we get started with today's meeting. So is there anything that folks want to touch base on before we get into the details? All right, I'm hearing not much desire to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. I guess that would be
Eric.
Yeah.
I noticed that John unmuted himself, so I wasn't sure if he wanted to jump in.
Yeah, John, is there anything you
No, I just was going to say that the 42-page document on housing production strategies, single-spaced, was interesting. I got it 8 days ago, and it's it seems like every page is the sort of a proposal for a PhD thesis, and I'm not saying it wasn't understandable or readable. It's just there's a ton of information in there, and the implications for all of these things are huge, and or could be huge. And I just wanted you to know that the whole thing is a little daunting. That's all.
Yeah, well, hopefully, this isn't the first time we've seen or been discussing these strategies, kind of been in the mix for a while. But yeah, I do understand that it is a lot. It's not the first time we've heard about these strategies, but certainly the first time we've been able to unpack all the sort of pros and cons along the way. So I definitely understand and appreciate that. We do have 2 meetings scheduled to get through the content here. So hopefully that will help. If there are any questions that you want to cover or anything specific to any of the strategies that you want to unpack further. So understood. We do have this is kind of the biggest piece of work I think that we've developed so far for this group, other than the HNA, which of course was huge, but there's a lot to kind of unpack here as a group, whereas the HNA was a bit more technical. So a lot more kind of analysis to kind of be had by the group on this. So I definitely understand, and we're here to answer questions, and we do have several more meetings before we go ahead and finalize anything in terms of the recommendations for the HPS. So like I said, we have another meeting kind of just to continue this one. It likely, we don't expect to be able to cover all the content within 2 hours today, but also we will meet once more to kind of take a look at the draft document and make sure that folks kind of are comfortable with things before we move forward. So yeah, I hope things aren't too fast and furious for folks, but I certainly understand and appreciate that comment, John. Yeah, I guess I think we're next on the agenda, it would be the approval of the minutes. So I guess I'll go ahead and hand it over to Vice Chair / Acting Chair Adler.
All right. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move we approve the minutes.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Yes, all in favor, maybe just raise a hand. Anyone opposed? All right, minutes are approved. Eric, do you want me to just walk through the agenda here, or do you want to kind of guide us through?
If you want to briefly go over that would be great, but we're gonna go over that a bit in our presentation too. So
okay,
wherever you prefer.
Oh, let's jump into the presentation. That'd be great.
Sounds good. All right, Kate, I think that is your cue there. Cool.
Does that look all right?
Yes.
Looks good.
Cool. Okay, there's the agenda.
All right, so obviously we've made our way through the minutes at this point. So the next portion of the presentation will just be me going over some of the comments we received to date regarding the housing production strategy specifically. Then Kate will start with the more sort of in-depth discussion regarding the recommended strategies and these strategies needing further discussion that were included in the memo, so it broke out into those 2 categories. So I'm hoping to use those 2 kind of categories to guide that discussion. And then I'll finish with next steps. But again, I think we're expecting that we'll probably need to use the majority of this meeting and another meeting to get through items 4 and 5 for the most part. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, Kate. All right, so in terms of public comments, I just wanted to make sure these are distributed to the group. We've gotten these over the course of the last several months, but I just wanted to kind of compile them here for everybody's consideration, really. Probably the most substantive comment we got was a letter from Mercy Housing Northwest, who is the developer that's currently developing a 100-unit affordable housing complex at the former Marylhurst University campus. We had a planning commission tour of that back in October, and have been kind of discussing that project, and we had worked with them for a while on the rezoning and sort of making the development feasible for them there. But they've additionally requested, in terms of the long-term stability of their project, a property tax exemption specific to affordable housing for their site. So that's kind of an interesting component there, not necessarily related to the initial funding or sort of getting the project off the ground, but just showing that these exemptions can really help mission-driven nonprofits maintain these over long periods of time and keep that mission sort of intact and at the focus of what they're doing. So that was interesting there. So I just wanted to make sure that that was sort of formally documented. You might notice they actually are hoping to do something a little bit earlier than the HPS, so they're eager to get going. Other comments we received were letters, just emails that we received at the basically housing email address that we asked folks to send their comments to the HPS task force. But we got 2 emails, both of which kind of use this phrase substantial zoning and code reform to enable greater housing production. So might have been a bit coordinated there. But yeah, generally speaking, the folks are concerned about the high cost of housing. One of the individuals was telling a story about how family members are not really able to move to Lake Oswego, and I think another was talking about how they're worried about being able to remain in Lake Oswego themselves as renters because they're looking to buy, and there's quite a significant barrier and hurdle to get over before they're able to purchase in the community and stay more long term. So that was kind of the nature of their comment. There was a lot more specific suggestions with regard to code changes and specific types of sort of moves under what we would probably consider the code audit and amendments strategy that were suggested within those comment letters. But generally speaking, they're looking for kind of higher density, more livable neighborhoods with safe transportation options and potentially even closer neighborhood commercial options. So interesting to see kind of public support for some of those moves. Any questions about the comments that we received as a task force? All right, well, I will hand it over to Kate, who will be doing the bulk of the presenting for the rest of our meeting here.
All right, thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. And I just wanted to point out that Brendan Buckley, that's also part of the consulting team, is on the meeting as well. So he's available to help answer questions. He kind of helped, especially with the sort of financial analysis of some of the policies and the analysis of the magnitude of impact of the policies, or excuse me, of the strategies. So we're going to start by talking about the strategies that our team recommends for inclusion in the housing production strategy. These are our initial recommendations. So obviously this is kind of a first draft, and we want to hear from you as to whether you agree with these recommendations. And actually, well, I'll get into the questions we want to ask you, but yeah, whether you agree with the recommendations and the sort of suggestions for timeline of implementation, and if you have any questions or suggestions, or if you need more information. So I did want to start off by just reminding you all of the housing needs. And we provided this summary at the last task force meeting, but just kind of wanted to help you keep these sort of at the front of your mind. So kind of the major themes that came from that housing needs analysis and stakeholder interviews and other components were obviously affordability. So there's a need for new housing units that are affordable at all income levels, from sort of the lowest income to the highest income. there's a particular need for housing that's affordable, of course, to the lowest income levels. And, especially in the sort of lower, below 50% of the median family income, and often even at the 80% MFI level, those housing units generally require some amount of government subsidy, especially the super deeply affordable units require quite a bit of government subsidy. But even moderate income housing that's in the sort of 80 to 120% of the median income, that also needs some additional support, whether that's some amount of subsidy or tax abatement or other types of incentives that kind of help encourage that type of income level of housing. There's also choices, more choices and more options. There's a need for options to meet all types of different preferences, housing configurations, housing sizes, single householders up to multi-generational households. The housing needs analysis also found a deficit of residential land for all density levels. And the HNA also found that a majority of new units that will be needed over the next 20 years are expected to be attached housing, whether that's some form of middle housing, duplexes, townhomes, or some type of multifamily housing. And then just to remind you of some of the key gaps in the market, I mentioned middle housing, also opportunities for aging in place as our population continues to age and sort of average age increases. There's a need for more options for home ownership that's more attainable for a wider range of households, as well as apartments for families that have 2 to 3 or even more bedrooms. And then multifamily housing that's outside of the town center has also been identified as a key gap. But then just to point out that Lake Oswego needs more housing overall, more housing supply. So part of the intent of a housing production strategy is just to increase housing production, sort of the rate of production overall. So just to preview some of the questions we're asking, and I've already kind of done this, but for these recommended strategies, do you agree that they should be recommended? Do they, are they helpful in contributing to meeting the housing needs that we just talked about? Do you agree with the timing of implementation? And we've identified kind of 3 buckets of timeframes, near, medium, and longer term. And then do you have any questions about, in particular, how these strategies could be implemented or should be implemented in Lake Oswego? So for the recommended strategies, a number of these we've already kind of talked about a fair amount. So I'm not going to go through each one and kind of explain it and give the pros and cons. Hopefully you all had a chance to review the memo. I know it was very lengthy, so I appreciate you kind of slogging through that. But definitely wanted to, a lot of the analysis that's included in that report is actually required to be included in a housing production strategy by the state. But it also, intended to help you kind of think through the trade-offs and how impactful the strategies could be. So these are the recommended near-term strategies. So these are things that the city could implement or begin to implement over the next 1 to 3 years. So these include the code audit and amendments, and that is generally working towards sort of general housing production goals, but then also increasing housing choices. So removing sort of regulatory barriers to all different types of housing. The next one is removing and reducing minimum parking requirements. That would also work towards sort of general housing production, but it would be especially beneficial to multifamily development and subsidized affordable housing development. The next 2 strategies are both tax abatement. There's sort of different tax abatement programs that would benefit government subsidized low income housing. One is specifically for nonprofit organizations. The other is open to nonprofit or for-profit developers. They have some different approaches, and actually once we get into the later discussion about other tax abatements, we have a full table that sort of compares all the abatement programs. But in the memo we provided in your packet, there's also a specific table that compares these 2, just so you can see, why the city might want to consider one or potentially both programs. So actually it's recommended to implement one or both. I think they could both be adopted and would kind of complement each other, and an applicant, a housing producer, could choose the program that sort of made most sense for their project. After that, we have public-private partnerships for affordable housing. This is something that the city is already engaged in. The Merrillhurst development is one example. It's something the city's kind of been pursuing on a sort of opportunistic basis. And this strategy would essentially sort of encourage the city to continue doing that and maybe seek out additional partnerships in the future. And then last, we have fair housing policy and education, which would be, updates to the city's comprehensive plan to encourage fair housing, or to, specifically affirm fair housing. And then also education for community, developers, property owners, renters, about fair housing issues. And so this isn't directly contributing to addressing housing needs, but it would work towards preventing housing discrimination and support other related strategies. Okay, so that's near term. And then in terms of medium term strategies, we are recommending rezoning land, which could be either rezoning non-residential land to residential, or rezoning lower density residential to higher density to increase capacity for multifamily housing. And that would be also working towards sort of general housing production goals. The next one is evaluating accessible design incentives or mandates, which is various ways to either encourage or potentially require, in some cases, that units be designed to be accessible. And there are various ways to approach that. You could establish a set of standards for universal design, which is kind of ensuring that units are kind of accessible to meet a wide range of needs. And this is something that we're recommending the city evaluate, because there are a lot of potential trade-offs, and there are sort of a lot of different ways the city could go with this. And I think it's probably not feasible within the process of the HPS to kind of identify specifically how the city should implement this, but it's something we would recommend that the city consider or evaluate, because opportunities for seniors, people with disabilities, is kind of a growing area, and sort of there's an increasing recognition that this is a need here and elsewhere. The next one is using tax increment financing or urban renewal to support affordable housing development. So this would likely involve designating a new urban renewal area, new TIF district, and then incorporating affordable housing into the plans and strategies for that TIF district. And then the last one in the medium term category is doing an affordable housing preservation inventory, which would essentially go out into the city and document all of the existing either regulated affordable housing or sort of low, what's called naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's kind of a first step of a longer term preservation strategy. So it's kind of a sort of a more bite-sized chunk that the city could undertake over the next several years. And then lastly, in the longer term category, we have modifying system development charge fee, the fee schedule, which is essentially a recommendation to scale SDCs by the size of units as opposed to kind of the unit type. So, smaller, more attainable units would have lower SDCs than larger units. And that would work towards supporting kind of more moderate income and smaller household needs. And then the last one is pre-approved plan sets for accessory dwelling units, which are kind of plans that have already been reviewed and approved by the building department and the planning department. And that would be kind of an easy way for a property owner to pursue an ADU and kind of reduce the cost and process involved in getting an ADU permitted. All right, so those are all the recommendations so far. So at this point, just want to open it up to questions, whether you agree or not with any of these strategies and the timing, and then do you have any questions or concerns? And I can jump up to the previous screens if you want kind of a reminder of the list. But Philip,
Yeah, I would
looks like you have
encourage
your hand
folks,
up.
yeah, just to go ahead and raise your hand on Zoom. We can go in order.
Did you call on me, Kate?
Yes, sorry, go ahead,
Oh,
Philip.
all right, thank you. So my if you could actually just go to the, I think it's the very previous, it's just the last slide, I believe. Yes. Okay. So my question or observation is about the last item, pre-approved plan sets for ADUs. I think that if the approach is taken that you could go out and find and see if these may already exist, and maybe they're being used in other cities, that have more of these sort of older type sort of neighborhood patterns where, there's just small lots and, more opportunities for these ADUs. I guess where I'm going is it seems like maybe this could be a shorter term solution if we take that approach and find that there's existing plan sets that we may be able to test fit and find that could work for Lake Oswego.
So your suggestion is maybe to potentially bump it up into the
Yeah,
more
it could
like
bump up
medium
into the
term.
medium term or even sooner than that, just depending on availability. And I think even if we do ultimately generate a handful of these for ourselves, it's something that could probably happen sooner.
Okay, great. Thank you. Casey?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot to unpack here. I guess so. Maybe I'll start with some questions I had at the kind of 30,000 foot level, and then kind of work down a little bit more granular. So one really quick question I had was when we use the word recommended, or we're making recommendations here that we're passing on, are we saying we are suggesting that you do all of the above? Everything that is included in here is a recommendation for you to pursue? Or are we saying here is a list of potential options, and from those you can draw a much smaller list of actual strategies to proceed with? So that's really a high level question I had. And then I had a question around the degree to which we are assessing the impact that these various strategies would have that are specific to Lake Oswego, meaning a lot of these are shown to work in communities large and small and elsewhere and at the state level, obviously. But I'm curious to know, to what extent have we zeroed in on those elements that make Lake Oswego, and would these strategies affect our community because of our scale, because of our makeup, whatever it is? Would they have a different impact if we in fact enacted them here in Lake Oswego? And kind of further to that, and this is something Erik brought up the other day when we started talking about our polling on these various strategies. It's not lost on me that I think we sent out this very detailed kind of poll for everybody to fill out and kind of give their priorities and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we only received a few dozen or so responses to that outreach in a community of 40,000 plus people. And so I think one question that I think we should at the very least take into account here is which of these recommended strategies in fact would be supported by the community at large if they were really aware of the potentially profound effect, even existential effect, it might have on things like livability and parking and driving around Lake Oswego, and just making sure that we're kind of staying on point, that while we might make a number of recommendations here, we want to make sure that we've got anywhere close to a majority of Lake Oswegans who are actually behind these strategies, particularly if they would do things like eliminate parking requirements or incentivize a dramatic spike in density in a certain area of town that might be above and beyond requirements, but might otherwise really affect issues of livability in certain neighborhoods. And so I just want to make sure we have our kind of ducks in a row on a couple of these fronts.
Okay, I'll start with a response and then maybe hand it over to Erik.
I'm sorry, I dropped lunch there.
No, that's okay. To answer the question about what these recommendations mean, or what does the term recommendations mean?
Yeah.
I would say in this case, this is kind of the project team's recommendation to Planning Commission and City Council, initial recommendation. I think it would be helpful to have kind of a task force recommendation. So if you all agree with this list, then it could become sort of the project team and task force recommendation for this, City Council and Planning Commission to consider whether all of these strategies should ultimately be included in the final housing production strategy. So that's
just to clarify there a little further. So they are in fact all being recommended, or are these just a list of options from which they will make recommendations?
So we,
yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So we started with a very large list at some of the first
Yes.
meetings, right?
Yes.
So this is our refined list that we're recommending. So all of it.
So we're recommending
so
that
this
they
is a much smaller
all
list than we started with. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's that. In terms of your question about assessing impacts specific to Lake Oswego, I would say definitely yes, that was the lens that we brought when we considered, sort of the magnitude of impact and whether this would be feasible in Lake Oswego. We definitely considered sort of the local market realities. I might hand it over to Brendan to add more to that if he has anything more to add. But yes, I mean, these aren't, obviously these have been considered in a lot of places, and we've kind of pulled our knowledge from experience working in other places, but that was definitely, I mean, we were thinking about would this work specifically in Lake Oswego?
Yeah,
Brendan?
I just
that was the process that we used to make the recommendation, in fact.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So for example, just to give you an idea of what's going through my mind here. So for example, something that we're dealing with on the Transportation Advisory Board right now is the question of tolling impacts on Lake Oswego. So for example, if the 205 and I-5 tolling goes into effect and people start diverting onto the 43 and elsewhere to come through LO, you could see a dramatic impact in the amount of traffic that you see in the city. And if we had some kind of confluence of events like the elimination of traffic requirements and an addition of density coupled with that diverted traffic, does that make moving through Lake Oswego an entirely different proposition for people who live here? Like, does our livability get impacted dramatically if we did one of these choices versus another? So I just wanted to make sure I was kind of flagging those scenarios.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about some of the interrelationships here, but when it comes to some of the strategies that you're mentioning, these are things that ultimately are kind of either happening somewhat outside of the process of the Housing Production Strategy Task Force, either with the tolling project being completely kind of within the world of TAB, or the sort of parallel process that the climate friendly and equitable communities parking reform kind of conversation has been running on. So, all I can say is that these are recommendations, when we say like rezone land, obviously that could look so different depending on kind of where we focus or really what we're talking about. All of these little things come out when we actually explore the project. So really what we're doing right now is coming up with a work plan over a very long period of time. So we're saying, all right, we're going to look at rezoning to increase housing capacity in the city. There would be a larger process related to that where we'd go through and say, all right, well, there might be some significant traffic impacts if we were to look at rezoning in this area, or, kind of weigh the pros and cons as we go through that. Specifically when it comes to, character, physical character of what, we want things to look like. And a lot of those specific elements, we don't want to be presumptuous and would be, sort of determined through a large community engagement process for each of these. You can imagine that some of them would be, more significant than others, particularly for like a rezoning or a code audit, as compared to something like a, housing preservation inventory. You can imagine that just like any planning project, we would make sure that it's, the scale is appropriate to the nature of the effort. But yeah, a lot of those concerns that you're pointing out are good for us to know that there could be kind of a confluence of things that kind of come to a head here, but ultimately, the idea would be to try to not exacerbate those existing issues. And there are a lot of areas of the city where, I think we would think that there could be a viable place to add density. And I think it would be something that we wouldn't consider to be, completely out of character or completely sort of drastically affecting livability. I think that's something that ultimately is always a concern when it comes to any of the projects here. Ultimately we have a specific goal that we're supposed to be, working on here for the state, and that's to talk about ways to increase housing production. Some of these could have more impact on livability than others, but they're also, a lot of the devil is in the details. So I guess that's kind of that.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the devil in the details, because I guess my kind of overriding existential concern is I want to make sure that we not, that we don't, in effect, start making a series of recommendations at the end of the day, which frankly, no one wants. We end up with like a 5% or 10% approval citywide on one of these recommendations because we weren't getting into those details, or at least making folks aware to the extent we're going to be making these. That's there.
So yeah, we've been trying to do, I guess a few things on that. So these recommendations came out of a number of different outreach, techniques that we use for the past, 6 months or so, I guess, since the fall. So there are a lot of, there was the survey originally that was distributed to the task force. That's not the only thing this was based on. We also had a very in-depth conversation about these, how to meet sort of certain needs and breakout groups at our last meeting that went into informing this recommendation list, as well as input from the Planning Commission and City Council. And of course, technical kind of, expertise and sort of professional kind of recommendations came in when it came to, what's appropriate for like Oswego or not. So, I think it's worth pointing out that, this is something that, once we have kind of a better sense of where this is going, we will be able to get more, well, I guess I should say, actually, at this point, we're going to take these same strategies for actually the recommendations that project team came up with based on sort of the input we've gotten so far, and take these out to the public for more input, more or less, and try to get a little bit more detailed input, both at a public meeting and through some sort of outreach, websites and things like that, that will be offered in March. So really, the Housing Production Strategy Task Force has like the first opportunity to provide input on these things. That's kind of what you're here for. You're our representative group to provide us with that sort of early input, and we will of course get input from a variety of other channels and incorporate that into the recommendations. Yeah.
Okay, so then, and I'll be quiet here, but so then I guess my piece of feedback or input at this early stage would be to say it might be worth separating, to the extent you're able, which of these strategies would have a much more profound impact versus much more focused, very selective impact in different pockets. And to the extent you're able to identify changes that would have a even existential change to core pieces of Lake Oswego, figure out ways in which we can really engage the broader community and make sure that we are getting buy-in to some of these recommendations, if in fact they are bigger in scale.
Yes, that is something that, again, with any outreach effort related to, again, we're kind of identifying projects. Some of them will require more outreach than others, et cetera. We do have the memo that kind of identifies magnitude. So when you look at kind of the impacts in terms of like what we expect, I think that hopefully that magnitude section gets at like the amount of impact we expect to have, that particular strategy to have. And of course, depending on the amount of impact, we would have a more robust community engagement strategy. And these are things that, again, the task force really is not going to be able to get into a detailed sort of recommendation when it comes to specifically where to rezone, or specifically, a lot of these are pretty broad strategies that have a lot more detail to be hashed out. So, I think generally speaking, there's no sense or desire here to dramatically change the city or to existentially kind of change any direction that the city has been going. We've been working to sort of build multifamily, bring affordable housing to the city, increase housing production in the city for many years now. So I think, in no way do we think of this as like a departure from that. So I hope that kind of addresses some of the concerns that you've discussed here. But yeah, I think when it comes to the outreach in particular, there's a lot more to be talked about, because ultimately we're going to be recommending we need to do a process for rezoning. When it comes time to do a rezoning, we will have a much larger process that will unfold at that point, if that is a recommendation. So, anything else, Kate?
No, I'm good for now. I'll be quiet for now. Thanks.
I don't have any other responses, but yeah. And I think Rosalie was next in the queue.
I was just going to say that I agree that the ADU thing could be moved up to not so far away. I think if you have something pre-existing set of plans, I mean, people want simplicity. I mean, there might be some folks who would be into having an ADU if they could just, if it was simpler for them, a simpler process. And also I wanted to ask about the housing preservation inventory and how that all works with what the housing production, how it relates, and it's supposed to mitigate displacement, or when you have the inventory, what do you do with that? That's it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, so the inventory is really kind of a first step, and it's an important step for the city to understand what its existing sort of lower cost housing landscape looks like. I know that, Lake Oswego, from what we've heard from staff, and you all probably have the sense that there's less sort of existing lower cost, more affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing in Lake Oswego as compared to some other places. But the city hasn't actually done kind of a full inventory to determine that. So that would be kind of the first piece of analysis that the city could do. And then if it seemed like there was, there was opportunities to preserve some of the existing, naturally occurring affordable housing through various strategies, then that would be kind of another step. And in the group of strategies that we kind of identified as contingent strategies that would really depend on the city having a new funding source to fully implement. One of those contingent strategies is a low-cost housing or affordable housing preservation strategy. So that would basically convert housing that's existing low cost into permanently affordable housing to prevent displacement of those existing lower cost or lower income residents. So I think doing the inventory would kind of give the city more information to kind of pursue that sort of broader strategy.
Thanks. What are the parameters of what you would consider the housing stock that you want to preserve, if that makes sense?
That's a good question. I think it probably depends on the local jurisdiction and sort of the market realities and sort of comparison to median incomes in the city. So I don't think there's one answer for all cities. It would be kind of up to the city to determine what the sort of thresholds would be of existing sort of rental prices and things like that. I don't know, Brendan or Eric, if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I would agree that depending on the community, it needs a little more discussion on how to come up with a formula of what you would include under affordable housing. Obviously, actual subsidized affordable housing, you'd want to be aware of where all that is, but I think most communities already have a sense of that. But you can have a formula based on sort of incomes of people where they're already living, and If they, if they need help with their housing costs to stay in place, there's those kind of considerations. There's looking for specific types of properties. Perhaps if you're have any remaining manufactured, or I'm sorry, like mobile home communities. There are types of housing that can be more affordable or lower cost types of housing. And those can also become sort of attractive opportunities for redevelopment to turn into more expensive, less affordable housing. And so identifying those and knowing where those are is an important step in trying to head off some of these natural market-driven processes.
Yeah, I guess, I just in terms of like how we would define affordable for this purpose, I would imagine that we'd probably want to, get as much data as we could. So I think, defining them based on area median income, we can put those into different categories and treat them differently. But yeah, I wouldn't say we would want to only look at 80% of AMI or below. I think it would be good to see 80% and below, as well as 120 to 80% of AMI. So anyway, I think we would want to try to get as much data as we could, really, and look at that in context. So.
All right. Let's see, Mayor Buck, I guess you're next in the list.
Well, thanks, Kate. I just wanted to share that we had our, and some of you may have been there, but our annual Board and Commission Summit, and we kind of did a SWOT analysis of sorts, identifying kind of a vision for the future and threats and opportunities, and pretty much universally amongst the various tables we had at that summit, the groups identified housing as our single largest threat, the increasing cost of housing. And so I think there's just for the group to rest assured that there is a large amount of community support, broad community support from folks of all different backgrounds that represent us on the boards and commissions that see that as a real threat, both to folks who are living here, to our economic health, our ability to continue with a strong school district and everything else. And I mean, Eric mentioned this earlier, but the council did take a pass at the broader range of strategies, and we eliminated any of those strategies that we felt were just not politically or practically feasible. And so all of the strategies you see here are ones that at least were somewhat palatable, some more than others, to the council. And then Eric also made a good point that a lot of these would have additional, process behind them going forward, like rezoning, tax increment financing, where, I think the council sees opportunities, especially in the area. But some things the council took off the table were things like bond funding. I think we really strongly support the regional housing bond and that renewal of that funding, and know that we have a lot of demands on our current tax base, and there's concern around pricing, continuing to increase the cost of living through additional taxes. I did have a question. Is there any, for some of these, like affordable housing preservation, I mean, do we have any kind of cost or funding source identified for any of these various strategies that would come with a cost?
Well, you might have noticed that we added the strategies that City Council did not enjoy or feel very strongly about. We did still kind of keep the construction excise tax in the conversation, just because that is one potential source of funding. That's kind of the one potential source of funding that we're still like, well, we could unlock certain things if we were to go down this route, and we could frame it in a certain way. So really, that's kind of, a conversation we wanted to have about the sort of, we're not sure what to do with these strategies at the next category. The kind of ones where we're looking for a little bit more guidance from you on. So, I think, yeah, a lot of this stuff is contingent on a funding source, and the inventory is something that is relatively low barrier, but in order to actually make that functional and sort of take that information and do something with it that's successful in the community, I think we would probably want to look at a funding source. So that's just kind of a pro and con, or kind of a cost and benefit situation that we have to think about. There are some strategies where we really are contingent on the presence of a funding source to move them forward. Obviously, things like tax exemptions, rezoning, it's a little bit different. So yeah, a little bit of a long answer there, but I think when it comes to the inventory, that's something that we do think that we could come up with without additional kind of funding source. But in order to do something like a community land trust or some type of revolving loan program, that might be a lot more challenging.
Well, thanks, Eric. I wonder what the group would think about, even a strategy around just being cognizant and aware of having Lake Oswego take advantage of these regional funding sources like the regional housing bond, which of course now the first one's exhausted, but just having that be identified as something that we would want to try to make good use of, here locally. That's obviously how the Hacienda project is being funded in large part there on Boone's Ferry. Yeah. Anyway, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Good. You're not going through all this information.
Absolutely. We tried to capture that within our public-private partnership sort of category, but it's very broad in that one, so it could mean a lot of different things. And yeah, we could make more specific note of the Metro bond funding that's available to us.
Right. And I think it's good. I just want to, we have over this past few years, there has been, and like I said, the community, especially those who are kind of involved in the know, paying attention to what's going on, they see threat that the rising cost of housing poses to the community. They see families, the concern about people's kids, not being able to live here, the kids that grew up here. They see their friends and family being displaced, priced out of the community. So these are real concerns people have. But we also hear concerns that there's a real change, to the community. I mean, these family affordable projects that are in the pipeline right now are the first family affordable, aside from we have the senior, secured senior to 2 places. So of course we had more back in the day, but that went away. And now, so so that's a real concern too. I mean, we had even concerns around just the middle housing, take the affordability out of it, just different types of housing. That's been a concern. There's concern around cottage clusters. There's concern around townhouses, all these things. So, but I think it's good just to remember that we have all of this is based on our housing needs analysis, and we're a town of 18-some thousand housing units, and we're going to continue growing. But of that, we have to provide, we're the identity of the community isn't changing. It's just being enhanced, for the better. It's kind of, so we have heard these concerns, people were, wow, like we're just going to somehow really change the landscape of the community with all this affordable housing. Remember, like this is a minuscule percentage of our overall housing stock. So it's just good to keep that in mind. Like we're not looking at tens of thousands of deeply affordable housing units, that, I mean, we're constrained in the land we have. And again, our goal is to provide just for a range, and the reality is, given the cost of land here, we're very limited. It's very, very expensive to build. I'm sorry, Crystal, or Kristen, I'm sorry, you're not on mute and you're kind of cutting in. I just want to. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point. It's good to keep the whole scale of what we're doing here in that context of the housing needs analysis there.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that, a lot of what we heard in the community survey, the citywide community survey, as well as input that we've gotten on this project so far, has been really focused on the difficulty that people have remaining in Lake Oswego, making it possible so their family members can move to Lake Oswego, or their children, after they graduate and or want to move somewhere sort of more permanently, being able to actually come here and live adjacent to their family. And yeah, I think a lot of this effort is really about preserving the character of the city by allowing folks that want to live here, that grew up here, to live here, and providing more opportunities for that sort of stability that a lot of folks have, really been, even the folks that live here are really struggling with the fact that it's not going to be, the prices are rising so high that they can't afford to buy at this point, where maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they could have purchased, and their kind of options are limited. So a lot of what we're doing is in response to those concerns that we've heard amongst the community that say, we really want to be able to stay here, and there just aren't enough options for us to do that. So I think that is really the sort of overarching purpose here. But of course, we do have requirements from the state as well, and we do have to kind of meet the quantitative sort of at least kind of some type of make an argument that we're meeting our housing need based on state law as well. I'll take a back seat here, though. We do have another comment, it looks like, from John.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say that I second what Casey had to say about some of the questions he had. And I really appreciated what Joe just said about the scope and nature of, what kind of remanufacturing of the city we're actually going to be doing, and how many units we're talking about, and that kind of thing. I think that's important. You wanted us to go through this, so just briefly, just a couple of thoughts. It seems to me that the code audit and amendments that you're talking about here are things that ought to be ongoing anyway. So this is I'm not sure. I mean, I see why it's focused on our interest in our project here, but it ought to be happening regardless. The fair housing policy and education, which you include, I completely support, and but that also ought to be ongoing. We should be doing fair housing here, and if there are things in our codes and that kind of thing that we're not, then we should get to that and fix that. And I'm not sure that has anything to do with affordability, but it's important. And then the last thing I would say is I do have some experience, having been on LoRa and that kind of thing, and worked on the downtown redevelopment of Lake Oswego. I do have some experience with tax increment financing and with the foothills area and the floodplain and all the things that are associated with that. And I still think, in terms of providing us a potential for a neighborhood that would include all kinds of housing, including affordable housing, the greatest potential in our community is there. And we ought to be moving that out of the second tier onto the first tier. And we ought to be really trying to make that happen in a way that will be compatible with the rest of the development of the city. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Just on the first comment there, in terms of the code audits and amendments, saying that we should do them more regularly. Of course, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with this, but we do annual code amendments within the planning department to do more kind of cleanup or housekeeping type things. But the idea, I guess, specific to inclusion of this in the housing production strategy would be to focus those recommendations and the audit on housing production specifically. That's not always the lens, and there's multiple lenses that you look at, I guess, with those annual code amendments. So we try to introduce that as a consideration, of course, but that is the sort of overarching kind of lens that we propose to use there. And yeah, I think I really appreciate your input on the tax increment financing. I think that's helpful. I would clarify, I think when we say medium term, longer term here, we're not necessarily saying, the city should wait on something. It's more, this is when we expect the impact to be seen, more kind of thing. So when it comes to pre-approved plan sets for ADUs, I think it's likely that we could generate that fairly quickly as a city. I don't think the actual sort of project to create that would take too much time, but we wouldn't expect that the impacts would happen for a little bit longer, just due to the nature of that type of strategy. So, I think certainly could see, TIF being something that could happen on a shorter term basis, but it's more just kind of based on our research. It seems like the impacts would probably be felt more in like a 3 to 5 year period. So. But that doesn't mean that we can't prioritize it. Anything else you want to add there, Kate?
No, nothing else to add. Thanks.
Great. All right, Joe.
Can I just add? Sorry, I appreciate John's points, and it kind of going back to Casey's good points too. what's unique, something that is unique, I think unique about Lake Oswego is we do, and this is what we talk about when we talk about the code, I think, at least this is how the council is thinking about it, and it would be good to get input really from this group on it, is that, we've got different residential standards for every neighborhood. John knows this, the council, right? We got so many sub-standards, not substandard, but it's crazy. Even along Boone's Ferry, there's different components of depending on which little pocket you're in, materials you have to use, and it makes it really complicated. And so if you're a builder that builds here day in and day out, well, I mean, you know this. Yeah, but if you're coming into town and to do a product that we don't have, maybe more middle housing, it's complicated, really complicated. So I think that's the council, has in mind, like, do we need to streamline that a little bit? But again, to Casey's point, like, that's what a lot of folks feel makes the town unique, is that we've allowed the neighborhoods to have their own overlays. And so you take a base code and then you just add, well, in Uplands we do this, in Evergreen we do this, in First Edition we do this, and almost not every, but there's a chunk of overlays. So it'd be good to know if this group feels like those are worth preserving at the expense of the, complicated code it creates, or if that's something we should consider rolling back.
Casey?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree that it could be something we should take a look at. I think, Eric, if you wouldn't mind, could you flip back one slide here? Like, I'll give an example. Like, so for example, and I don't know if this is just the tab in me coming out here, but I'm honing in on the 1.2 about the minimum parking requirements in particular. And I'm just curious so let's just use this as an example here. So have we like synced with our transportation staff to say, okay, if we're limited in our housing supply to certain pockets within the city, and we know we're going to be bolstering density to these kind of corridors and these kind of neighborhoods, like, what would be the predicted impacts on parking and therefore, livability, if we are going to make these changes? And so if these are going to have the very specific effects on these particular pockets, and it could be our high volume corridors, for example, if we've got the bigger projects happening in Boone's Ferry, for example, like, what is that going to portend for the coming 3 to 5 years as folks move through the community? So it's like, this would be one example where we could really kind of hone in and take a look at that process and make sure we're just really capturing the impacts, particularly on livability, even if we are limited to specific areas around town. If certain changes could have a disproportionate effect, I think you just want to make sure that we're just keeping our eye on the ball there.
Yes, and we are. So the minimum parking requirement that we're referencing here in 1.2, strategy 1.2, is actually something we're required to do by the state. Yeah. So there's various shades of gray of what we can accomplish there, but all of the different options involve reducing or removing minimum parking requirements. So that is something where, the entire program that the state has proposed, those changes under the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, requires the city to go through and update our TSP to basically incorporate new assumptions about vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions and all sorts of different things after we kind of make decisions on what our policies are, after we know kind of a little bit more about where we're going to land with this decision, as well as the housing production strategy kind of areas of focus. So I guess that's all to say that, yes, this is something that will be incorporated into the TSP, and it'll have a bit more of a climate focus, I suppose, and be more focused on greenhouse gas emissions at that point. And that is the new metric that we're required to sort of use to comply with the state requirements. So all of these things are being looked at in sort of this larger unfolding strategy of, all right, so we know we have to do the HPS now. That's going to set in motion various other things related to, citywide comprehensive plan type changes that will impact, a number of things, including transportation. And, there is a specific sort of state process set up for us to, go back and modify some of those assumptions. In like a more immediate sense, though, I think that there is a certain understanding, in particular, when it comes to areas like Lake Grove, that there is a lack of on-street parking in that area, and that could be one area where these changes will. It's not a could. It's a that they will be met in some capacity in the Lake Grove area. So it's a matter of the city kind of complementing some of these strategies. We don't look at any of these as kind of in a silo or a strategy in and of itself. I think City Council and Mayor Buck in particular have repeatedly stressed that we look at all of these as interchanging pieces of a larger system where we really have to invest in things like pathways and safe pedestrian infrastructure, as well as parking, making sure that we're not creating any traffic impacts, and have accessible parking, particularly for businesses, so that they're able to continue to have businesses, or I'm sorry, have customers. But there are a number of different really important sort of components of this that we know need to be stressed, infrastructure as well. So these are things that we're tackling in kind of parallel processes. Some of these, we've talked about in the housing production strategy framework. Infrastructure in particular is one thing we did, but there are a lot of other large efforts underway to kind of bring things into sync, I suppose, with the decisions that we're talking about right now.
Great, thank you.
So that's not to say that there isn't more to be done there, but there are some kind of connections already, at least when it comes to the state framework that we're even responding to. I guess you're no longer Chair Stewart from the Planning Commission, but Phil.
Thanks, Eric. We sort of veered away from it a little bit, but I did want to go back to the remove or reduce minimum parking requirements, because we've sort of bantered this about in Planning Commission a little bit, and I wanted to clarify that doesn't mean ban or get rid of parking. What it means is developments will have the opportunity to provide or not provide parking, or reduce their minimum reduce parking if they want. Ultimately the need for parking is going to be driven by the market and the need for parking. It's just that I just want to clarify that this doesn't mean that all parking goes away. It just means that there's more options when developing a piece of property as to whether parking or as much parking is needed.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It certainly doesn't mean that parking is outlawed by any means. It's just providing a lot more flexibility, I suppose, particularly for existing developments that have changing tenants that sometimes are precluded from being able to locate, like a new business is kind of turned down from being able to locate due to parking requirements just on its space. So I think in particular, there are some changes that we're already kind of required to implement, that we've implemented, that get at this requirement from the state. But there's a conversation that we're still having kind of publicly, and this is a good reminder. I will be speaking at the Mayor's Roundtable next Thursday, the 22nd, regarding this issue on minimum parking requirements and the sort of city's response there. So not only will I be doing that, but we'll have other kind of outreach as well. Kind of we're planning an open house as well in March for that effort. So these are kind of parallel strategies, and we purposely actually asked for an extension on this climate-friendly, equitable communities parking work, so that we can try to sync up as best possible with this housing production strategy work. Also, my cat is here, so he wanted to join the meeting. All right, John.
Yes, I'm curious if you have reached out to the school district to ask what their response would be to some of these suggestions that might lower their revenue as the result of reduced property taxes.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. We have reached out to them and had some conversations, particularly surrounding the recent vertical housing development zone that we adopted a pilot program for in December. So fairly recently, we did that particularly kind of enable or really facilitate the development of the North Anchor properties in downtown. But we did hear concerns from the school district at that point, and that's something that we tried to put in the memo as well, that could be something that we do hear in terms of if we're actually going out you know, at least for the vertical housing program, there was a requirement to go out and talk to all the different taxing districts that would be impacted in order to even adopt that program. So, you know, just making sure that, you know, if your revenue goes away, are you okay with that if it's being used for this purpose type of conversation? And I think, yeah, Joe had those conversations specifically in person. But, you know, I think there was, you know, I think folks, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, Joe, but I did kind of get the sense that it's in particular from the school district that there was a desire to shape this a little bit more and make sure that the tax exemption is being used for affordable housing. And sort of, you know, there was concern, but I do think that it's a bit different than what we were talking about with the vertical housing development zone, which was more focused on sort of shaping and producing commercial ground floor and residential above kind of mixed use developments, as opposed to what we're talking about here, which would be really more focused on affordable housing, low income housing, nonprofit constructed affordable housing, things of that nature. So things that the school district might support more than just the sort of, I think, you know, not to say that North Anchor didn't include affordable units, but, you know, we can target this program a little bit more in terms of the tax exemption, and that could change the conversation.
Well, and there needs to be some kind of tax benefit analysis as it relates to the school district, because they may in fact lose revenue, but they may actually gain revenue by additional students. So what will the impact be? And because I think people in this community are going to be very concerned about that.
Yeah, and you know, that's just kind of a reminder again that all of these processes, you know, all of these projects and strategies really require their own processes. So we would not be able to even pass something like these tax exemptions without going out and getting input from the taxing districts. So Clackamas County is a big one. So there's a lot of different sort of taxing districts that are, you know, within the county, as well as LOSD, probably the most, you know, those are probably the most significant players in terms of those tax exemptions. So, and those are, you know, again, as Joe has a little bit more experience with the parties that express concern about the vertical housing development zone, although they didn't ultimately, you know, they did ultimately participate in the program and, you know, agreed to have those taxes exempted at that property.
Just to add to that, Eric, and maybe Brendan can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding too is that the city would have to get the other taxing jurisdictions buy-in if they were going to also exempt their portion of the property tax from the tax total tax fee. So I think if you didn't get the other jurisdictions buy-in, the city could exempt its own city taxes, but it couldn't exempt school district taxes if it didn't get their support and approval.
Yeah, there's kind of an opt-out option, or, you know, I guess, yeah, essentially that's the notice that we're provided for the vertical housing district that we proposed back in December. So I think there'd be a similar process, and regardless of if it's not required, we would definitely want to make sure, you know, that those taxing districts were on board. So I think though that's, you know, there's probably a little bit more outreach and education that we could do specifically targeted towards those parties when it comes to these programs to get a better sense of kind of what the receptivity is. So I think, yeah, that's kind of that is a concern and a consideration that we'll have to consider.
Eric, can I just John, it's a great question. The because of how school funding works in Oregon, you know, both the tax increment financing and these other tax exemptions, they don't really impact the funding to the school district because it's all, you know, combined in Salem and then distributed on a per capita basis. But what we are finding is that the school district is also very aligned, you know, with the city in our goal of increasing housing production and increasing it across a broad variety and levels of affordability. So they've been great partners in that way. And these new housing units that we're bringing online, the multifamily, are filled with kids. So like you made such a good point so it was actually even though we were giving a tax exemption to build housing downtown, it was a gain for the school district because again, they're paid on a per capita basis. And as we all know, the district has been on a steady decline in grade school aged children for quite some time because housing is getting so unaffordable that families move here later in life when their kids are a little bit older. So the secondary high school enrollment has been on the increase. But these projects that we're doing, the affordable ones, will include lots of grade school age children, which is great. So it not only does it, add to their bottom line, but it helps balance out the student population a little bit. It's a really good point though, and we do need to and have been working closely with the school district on these various topics.
Yeah, and I guess just to unpack this a little bit more, we didn't really have to do much of analysis for the site-specific tax exemption program that we had envisioned for North Anchor that we recently got approved by City Council. However, for something that would be more widespread, that would be applicable potentially citywide, or at least within a larger geography than just one particular site, we would need to do a more kind of in-depth analysis of the exact thing that we're talking about. What would this look like in terms of foregone revenue, and what would this look like in terms of potential increases in revenue as well due to increases in the student body number. So yeah, that's something that we would dig into a lot more granularly if we were to move forward with that strategy. Tang.
Here we go. Let me see if I can mute.
Already
I'm trying to unmute. Yeah, I'm trying to unmute. Oh, you can?
Yeah.
My name is David Tangvald, and a couple things. I like, Joe, I like the different neighborhoods and undoing kind of the standards, the overlays for each one, more of a color by numbers instead of color by architecture who was alive at the time standards, so that it was more congruent and more coherent, maybe a little bit more basic, so that builders can come in and enter our market. I think that's a valid point, and that we should, Eric, follow up on that, and make it a little bit easier for the common builder to participate in our marketplace. I think that's valid. I wanted to affirm that. And I remember, I'm coming from a renter's position at the current time as well. And the rent here in Lake Oswego is a burden on a family. But it can be done. It just needs to be the priority for the family. I mean, it really does. And so like in our situation, we have less house than we've ever had, because we can afford the rent in that situation. We also just empty nested too. So that worked out for us. And our big, Jennifer we've been married 30 years, and we're back in Lake Oswego where she was raised, for her and me too as well. I love Lake Oswego, and I was raised at Alpenrose Dairy. But the two things that I wanted to let this group know is that the two commanding, statements for us to move here was, one, Clackamas County, and two, what was the other one? It was Clackamas County, which we were able to do in the bottom of Mountain Park, and there was one other one I wanted to tell you. Oh, Lake Oswego, the schools. So Jennifer went to Lake Ridge, but now our house is located on the Lake Oswego side. So we're at the bottom of Mountain Park in the grotto there. And it's perfect for us now, but it is expensive. That that baby little house, the rent there, and I don't have a problem sharing this with you guys, it's $2,200. And that is set there because of my the relationships I have in my business. Otherwise, it would be more than that. And so I just wanted to, from my perspective, pull over and say those couple of things, because I think it's important that you guys hear some reality from a family, of 4 that's here. And our oldest, who's going to be 26 on Sunday, she lives at 1 Jefferson. And, that was, a month ago. I mean, that was crazy town up there. Crazy. She came down and lived with us for 12 days. And by day number 9, we were all looking at each other going, what's going on in that little house? But, the 1 Jeff situation up there, in the apartment situation, but straddling the county line and everything that's going on up there, where 5 buildings had to be shut off. There's 5 buildings for each water main, and there was 57 units with water damage. up there coming through the walls. You know, that was an enormous, enormous project, and you might have seen some social media about it. But that's a great example of from the apartments to the little rental that we're in to the giant houses, you know, less than a mile away on Lakeview, where we used to have a house as well. There's so much dynamic, and I hear what you're saying, Joe, on the overlays, but maybe we could just make it just a little bit simpler so that we can all participate and all understand and make it not basic, but a general concept instead of just so rigorous. That's my 2 cents. I hope that helps.
Incredibly helpful. Yeah, I appreciate it. Really good to hear that more current perspective and sort of put this in the context of recent ice storm and all sorts of things that have forced people to have some housing issues, I suppose, and need to figure things out on the fly pretty quick. So yeah, that's good to remember.
And on a side note on that, Eric, is and I did come down to City Hall to thank staff and the mayor on this, and I think it's important declaring that emergency and that was critical, you know, for housing. You know, if you've been behind the post office or behind Renaissance Homes there or up on South Shore, there's a couple places that were significantly hit. We could not move until Saturday. Matt Zafino was somewhere else, not, you know, with us. And we missed some obligations just because we could not move out of there. And this is a side note, it has anything to do with us, but we came together as a community right there in that group at Mountain Circle and made it by sharing and looking out for each other, because it was so icy that the cars slid out in the middle of the night into the road by themselves. And we all had to look out for each other. And that's what happened in there. Was everybody looked out for each other, and we all kept our storm drains clean. And that was just, you know, a community effort, everybody working with everybody out there. I'll be quiet now.
All right, well, thanks again.
You go.
Yeah, you know, I just want to make sure we're hearing from everybody here, so I might try to pick on some of you that I haven't heard from so far. I think Doug, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this kind of recommended strategies list. I hate to put you on the spot, but I want to make sure you feel comfortable saying something if you do in fact want to contribute.
I'm a listener. I've heard everything else. Everybody's got some positive notes. I have my own opinion, and sometimes it's better to keep my opinion to myself until all things are done. So that's all I got to say right now.
All right. I mean, in terms of the recommendations, do you have any opinions that you'd like to share with the group about what we're discussing?
I personally think if you remove some of the parking issues, that's going to be a problem. So that's just one of the items. Or if you reduce what's required for parking.
Okay. Appreciate the input. Yeah, again, as a reminder on that, that's kind of a requirement from the state. So that's something that, regardless of kind of what option the city chooses for compliance, that's something we've kind of already had to implement for state compliance purposes, and we'll be needing to implement even further before the end of this year. So that's kind of why we've included it here, is because it's kind of required and is something that does impact housing production. So yeah, I just wanted to put that into a little bit of context for folks. But I do appreciate the comment.
Eric, I'm seeing a hand raised by Ken, who's one of the attendees. Is he part of the task force?
No, yeah, we are happy to accept input kind of through alternate channels, but we don't allow for anybody other than the task force to contribute at these meetings. So. But that doesn't mean that we don't accept comment, and this will all be discussed at a number of different venues, including Planning Commission and City Council on they're going to be a joint Planning Commission and City Council meeting on April 2nd, as well as another kind of mention that we are going to be doing an open house sort of outreach kind of event at the end of March or mid to late March. So a lot of, that's still very preliminary. So this is still, just at this stage, there's some more opportunities in the next month or so. There will be a number of other opportunities at the hearings later, sort of in the fall, or sorry, in the summer and fall of this year. Phil.
It's the implementation stage, I realize, but it does fit right in because we have to have foresight on implementation. And I've been working with a group that we're forming on the affective impact upon individuals, affective being the emotional impact on an individual in a household or moving in or moving out. Everybody that's involved in any kind of a real estate transaction, they're people in life transition. There's a lot of emotional attachment. And so we have to tap in to that. I've been trying to get a group started that basically businesses that deal with real estate in some format that have equity and inclusion in mind, and also the businesses that attach first to people and second to their dollar, that they're in the business, love their business, but they love the people. I know that's a cliche, but they actually impact it that way, and have a group that's strictly based on that. And so I'm also thinking local business is a way of impacting the larger community as well, meaning that if you have local businesses involved in the transactions, whatever it is, as much as possible, then their families are being fed. Their relatives feel good about it. Their neighbors feel good about it. And you're starting to have an emotional impact upon the whole community that we don't want to leave that piece out till the last. We used to say the last dog is hung. I don't know if that's a old cliche from Wisconsin or not. So that's all I need to say now, but I wanted to bring that up at this point, that we include that in the implementation stage on any of these. And we're thinking ahead about, gee, how could we do that? So thank you.
I really appreciate you looking at things through that lens, Phil, and I think that's very important for when it comes to on the ground, just kind of thinking through I think the sort of emotional impacts of the various different decisions that we have on the table. And of course that looks kind of different depending on what strategy we're referring to, but there are so many different ways that we could try to account for that with the implementation. So I appreciate your focus on that, and for you to kind of continue to remind us of the importance of that, even though we're so high level. Kelly?
Hi, thank you. Kelly Reed with DLCD. I think DLCD is probably going to have a few comments on the draft recommended strategies, and I just wanted to know the timing of like when you need that by in order to kind of incorporate it into your next step. And then my second question, I just wanted to clarify, like when you say near term and medium term, for example, like the rezoning of land strategy is medium term. Are you thinking that like that will just take a while to do, and that's why it's a medium term, or would you be starting that process within years 3 to 5? Just trying to make sure we understand what that means.
I'll start with what my interpretation of the time frames was, which may have been a little bit different from Erik's. Maybe we should make sure we're syncing those up in the next version. But my thinking was that the near-term strategies are things that the city would be getting started on over the next 1 to 3 years, and then the sort of medium term are things that could potentially be started in that time frame, but maybe most likely because of the complexity or the sort of priority level would be started at year 3 and maybe implemented within the 3 to 5 years. And then longer term, obviously after that. Erik, does that Is that at least generally consistent with how you were thinking about
I
it?
think I guess I'm open to reprioritizing like when we do things, I suppose. But I do think though that yeah, at least that's I did have a different interpretation, is that I saw this as having kind of a longer horizon in terms of the actual housing production that we might expect to stem from it. So yeah, I think in short, Kelly, it sounds like we need more clarity there for you. But I do think that there is, certainly, none of that's set in stone too. So that's completely open for like conversation right now. And I do think that there is an opportunity probably to get started on the rezoning sooner than later, I would imagine. So we could probably put that into the near-term strategies, but yeah, I would expect that the impact would be not felt for a little bit longer.
And then,
but yeah, I think we will include more clarity in that, I guess, in the next round of documents for you. And when it comes to the opportunity to provide input, we are going to be taking this kind of recommended strategy list out to the public at large for the next month or so. I'm going to bring similar content to the City Council and Planning Commission in a joint meeting on April 2nd. So we probably, you could obviously provide comment as a part of those meetings, or there will be a lot more opportunity for us to actually change the document basically in April and May, and then we'll have another draft in June. So that's, yeah, you can provide comment whenever you want, but that's probably when we'll actually make those changes based on your input as well as input from the broader public and City Council, Planning Commission, etc.
Thanks. We'll make sure we get you any comments that we have in the next few weeks or so, certainly within the month of March. And I guess we'll send those straight to Erik, to you, Erik. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'll share them with the group as well, so that everybody's in the know. But thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I just want to make sure, that, I mean, we are kind of likely to move on to the next round of strategies, the next kind of bucket of like, we're not sure exactly where to go on these strategies. So I just want to make sure we're really covering our bases when it comes to the ones that we have currently included in this list for recommendations. Is there, anybody else that wanted to provide comment on this? Either, I guess it's the first 11 strategies or so. And I don't want to pick on people too directly. I think we've heard from most everyone, at least to some extent. Kirsten Baumgart, I'm not sure if you're able to participate right now, but I think Kirsten, we haven't heard from you. Thea, I think we've heard from DLCD at least, but I'm happy if you want to provide any comments as well. Yeah, anybody else, now's the time to kind of speak on the recommended strategies. And yeah.
Thanks, Erik. I think that as Kelly said, we'll just be submitting a couple of comments to you. No major concerns, but it's great to follow along, and just might ask for a little bit of clarification down the line. But yeah, great to hear from you guys.
Appreciate it. Yeah, and I think just as a reminder, we will have the next meeting to talk about these things for folks that might not have something that they can think of right now that they want to contribute, because there wasn't that much time to look at these materials. So it's not like the last opportunity for folks to weigh in on this, but we really do want to have. This is when we had intended to have this discussion at least. So yeah, just want to make sure we hear from everyone that wants to contribute. And I think we may have, yeah, Kate, what do you think? Should we move on to the next section here?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. All right, so yeah, moving on to the strategies that need further discussion. So I think the first set of strategies are things that we generally felt comfortable recommending because they generally had support from you all, from the City Council and Planning Commission. and seem to have, a significant either moderate or higher impact on housing production. And this other, strategies needing further discussion could be high impact strategies, but maybe haven't necessarily received as much support so far, or not as clear support from City Council, Planning Commission, and you all. Or maybe they're kind of more sort of on the fence in terms of impact that might have a lower impact, but that, even strategies that have maybe a lower impact in terms of unit production or preservation, they still could be important because they're meeting a certain kind of slice of the housing need, or working towards something important. So definitely wanted to keep talking about these and get some additional input. So this is the list here. We have five strategies in this category, in this bucket. Zoning incentives for affordable housing. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about each of these, since some of these we've talked a little bit about, some of them we haven't talked as much about. So I did want to present a little bit more information about each one. But this slide just kind of provides the summary of the housing need that each of the strategies is working towards. So the first two are working towards meeting the government subsidized low income housing need. The vertical housing development zone tax abatement, we've talked about that one a little bit already, but that's kind of typically works more towards moderate or higher income, although there is an affordable housing provision included in that. But it's specifically intended to incentivize mixed use, commercial and residential and higher density housing. And then the MUPTI, or the multiple unit property tax exemption, works towards incentivizing multifamily or middle housing. It can also be structured as a pretty flexible program that can be structured to meet more specific targeted housing needs. And then pre-approved plan sets for middle housing is kind of more about housing choices. Middle housing is a different housing choice compared to, sort of more typical single family development. It also is a way to increase home ownership options, more attainable home ownership options. So for each of these strategies, and obviously we're going to kind of run out of time in this meeting to talk about these in depth, but we will have a whole separate meeting in 2 weeks to continue the conversation. So we'll kind of get started, and then you all can go back and think about these a little bit more and come back with more questions and suggestions. So for these strategies, we want you to consider, given all of the needs that we've talked about from the housing needs analysis, should we consider this strategy to be included with the other recommended strategies for the HPS? Is it an effective strategy to meet the needs that we've identified? And then would you recommend it being included? Should we just remove it, take it off the list? Or is there any other information that you would need before you can kind of make that decision or recommendation? And then an overarching question is, how successful do you think the city's housing production strategy would be without a new funding source? For example, if the CET were not included. So keep that in mind. Oh, it looks like Casey, you have a question.
No, if you're not, please keep going. I thought you wanted some feedback right there. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was just a kind of a preview of the questions, things to keep in your mind as we're going through each of these. And I think I'm going to try to go through all of these slides. There's five strategies to go over, give you all the information, and then we can kind of go back and maybe talk about each one individually. But given that, especially since we're kind of running out of time, maybe go through all the information, and then we can start today and then finish in a couple of weeks talking about each of these. Okay, so zoning incentives for affordable housing. So this is a kind of a zoning-based strategy. It would be implemented through the development code that would allow height, density bonuses, or floor area ratio bonuses, or potentially relaxing other zoning standards, specifically to support affordable housing development. And this is a general approach to that would allow affordable housing developers to make more efficient use of their land, and potentially to better compete for land with market rate developers. One important thing to keep in mind is that there was legislation a couple years ago, Senate Bill 8, that actually allows or requires cities to allow height and density bonuses for affordable housing. That is, and one of the sort of eligibility criteria is it needs to be owned by a nonprofit or a public agency, or a religious nonprofit agency. So any housing that is affordable, meeting certain income criteria, meeting some other criteria as well, it's laid out in the legislation, but that housing needs to be allowed in the city, and it's automatically given height and density bonuses. So anything that the city might do, that's kind of already taken care of essentially. But the city could either consider bonuses that kind of go above and beyond that state requirement, or it could consider other types of bonuses in addition to height or density, such as reducing minimum open space requirements or other types of sort of additional flexibility. This strategy we kind of put in the sort of low to moderate category. And I think that's because it's not likely to, encourage developers to include affordable housing units in their development necessarily, but it might lead to at least a small increase in the number of units that are possible for an affordable housing development. So basically, you could maybe fit additional units on your site, or it might kind of make a project pencil out that wouldn't otherwise work. So moving on to the next one, this is kind of the big one, construction excise tax, that obviously there's kind of mixed opinions on this one so far, but we did want to keep talking about it just because it is one of the few funding sources that's available, and really the only one that's kind of left in the strategies that we're still considering. So, and we've talked about this already, but just to provide a little bit more information, this is a tax on construction projects. It's specifically kind of laid out in statute how it can work and how the funds can be used. And so for a tax on residential construction, you can apply up to 1% of the permit value. For non-residential or commercial and industrial construction, there's no cap on the tax rate, but in terms of the cities that have already implemented a CET, the typical rate is somewhere between 1% to 3%. And then the uses of the CET funds, for residential CET, that's a little bit more structured. 50% need to go toward developer incentives, such as like SDC reductions or tax abatement, kind of backfill. 35% is flexible and can be applied to various affordable housing programs. 15% goes to the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department to support home ownership programs. But OHCS's typical process is to spend those funds that they collect back into the cities that pay into that program. And then for commercial and industrial CET, it's a little bit more flexible. So 50% need to go towards housing related programs. And it's actually not specified in statute that those need to be limited to affordable housing. So keep that in mind. And then the other 50% is unrestricted and kind of can be used as the city decides. So a few things to keep in mind here. As I've mentioned, this is one of the few locally controlled funding streams for affordable housing. And without a new funding stream, the city really couldn't contribute meaningfully to some of these contingent strategies. So we talked about preserving low-cost rental housing to mitigate displacement. Community land trust is an opportunity for affordable home ownership. Low-interest loans or revolving loan fund can either contribute to sort of housing upgrades or could actually go into a housing development loan program. And then a housing trust fund is kind of a way to sort of pool resources and then allocate them to support affordable housing. It is important to keep in mind that this raises cost for construction of commercial, industrial, or market rate residential housing. And that I think is probably the biggest concern that we've heard from City Council, other folks that maybe have some concerns about this strategy. However, the city is able to exempt certain types of development. So regulated affordable housing, public buildings, hospitals, and some other specific types of development are already exempted by state law, but the city can choose to exempt other certain types of development. And I'll give some examples of that in just a minute. But because this program, has the potential to generate quite a bit of revenue for affordable housing, to support affordable housing, we're putting this in the high magnitude category. And based on some analysis that Brendan did looking at past permit data, if the city were to apply a 1% CET across the board for residential and non-residential, it could generate, $750,000 per year for on the residential side and $850,000 for the non-residential CET. So pretty significant annual revenue potential with this tax. We included some examples of, this was in the sort of supplemental CET memo that we provided, but just so you can see how some other cities are implementing this program. You can see that there's kind of a range of percentages, but generally in the 0.5 to 1% range on both residential and commercial or industrial. Some cities have chosen to exempt a number of different types of development from the CET. So Tigard exempts small ADUs, projects under a certain value under $50,000. They also exempt up to 75% of CET from middle housing types to sort of, not place too much of a burden on those types of more attainable sort of market rate development. City of Eugene also exempts units that are sold for kind of a moderate cost, or actually I would say a lower cost for home sales, $250,000. And then projects that are granted the MUPD tax exemption, which they've already implemented there. And then Milwaukee also exempts projects valued under a certain cost. So just some examples there of ways that cities are kind of modifying this program to kind of work well and to not sort of preclude the kind of housing or not burden the type of housing that they want to see built in the city. Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Kate?
We've got, yeah, oh yeah, sorry. I'm not looking
sorry.
at
I just wanted to, I know we're trying to move quickly. I just wanted to point out one thing. When it comes to the CET, it just might be good to think, I think we heard concern that we wouldn't want to sort of, impact development and tax, certain types of development. But I think you can notice here that certain cities are exempting, smaller sort of projects that are sort of residential units under 250,000 or less. So I guess I want to get folks thinking about, are there any exemptions that might change your opinion about CET and whether or not this is something that the city should consider? I think just want to point out that we do have, beyond the exemptions that we're required to allow by state law, we do have some latitude as a city to, do things that are similar to, Tigard or Milwaukee or Eugene. So just something to consider before next meeting.
Casey, you got a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Kate. I just wanted to confirm, it's great that you're going through these, but I just wanted to confirm, are we not going to discuss, have time, given the 14 minutes left, to discuss any of these at this meeting? Okay, I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I think if you have clarifying questions, we can definitely get to those. But yeah, maybe it's best to just save our discussion for the next meeting so that we can have that all at one time. Okay, keep going. So the next one is the vertical housing development zone tax abatement. So again, this incentivizes multi-story mixed-use development. So the city kind of chooses the areas where it wants to apply this and places where it wants to encourage that type of development. Those become the vertical housing development zones. And this works as a 10-year partial property tax abatement. It's up to 80% of the total tax for the improvement value. So that's the building and the site improvement wouldn't apply to the land value unless you do include affordable housing units. And so if you do that, then you can have an additional exemption of the land value. So you don't have to include the affordable units, but if you do, you kind of get an extra bonus. Erik has talked about the pilot program that was recently approved for the North Anchor development site. So the city's already kind of testing this out in one location. It is important to point out that depending on where this strategy is applied, it does have the potential to displace residents if they're existing kind of lower income residents in an area that's designated as a vertical housing development zone. By encouraging redevelopment, it has the potential to displace those folks. So I think that has to be a consideration, and the city would maybe want to avoid areas that could have that type of impact. In terms of magnitude, putting this in the sort of low to moderate category, in terms of affordable housing, it's not as likely to incentivize that type of housing as compared to some of the lower income, below income housing abatements that we talked about earlier. But it could be beneficial in some areas where the city does want to encourage that type of housing. I think we've heard that it can be kind of a challenging program just because of the sort of administrative requirements. It's a little more complicated than some of the other tax abatements, so something to keep in mind. Another tax exemption program is the MUPD. So I've mentioned this is a very flexible program. It does incentivize or focuses on multifamily and middle housing, so multi-unit housing. It's also a partial exemption for 10 years. However, the exemption could be longer if there is an affordability agreement. So the exemption would be correspond to the length of that affordability agreement. The city does have broad discretion to structure the program. So it could include requirements for affordability. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it could. It could do things like require accessibility for the units or universal design strategies. It could have targeted unit sizes. So it could say, units under a certain size or units that that include, 2 or 3 bedrooms qualify for the MUPD. And there are other types of features that the program could be targeted to. So again, very flexible and can kind of fit it into towards meeting the needs that are kind of biggest in the community. Some considerations, this could potentially outcompete some of the affordable housing tax incentives in the case of for-profit developers that would rather build market rate housing. So in other words, this might kind of counteract some of the work of the low-income housing tax abatements, or anyway, it could compete with the low-income tax abatement programs. We determined that it could have a moderate impact in Lake Oswego. So it could encourage production of more types of housing that are not currently being met by the private market. It's not expected to have a very high impact, and probably less likely to have a big impact on affordable housing as compared to the low-income housing abatement programs. This table just compares the 4 different tax abatement programs that we're considering. I don't need to go into this in detail, but just to kind of point out that some of the main differences are that the nonprofit low-income housing program only applies to nonprofit organizations. That one does require annual renewal, but there's no time limit for that abatement, whereas the other 3 are time limited. Although the MUPD could also be unlimited or it could be paired with an affordability agreement that's a longer term agreement, say 60 years. Obviously, some of them have affordability criteria. The vertical housing development zone, if there is an affordability or if there are affordable units included, they have to be affordable to 80% AMI income levels. The MUPD program would be up to the local jurisdiction to determine how that's defined. So again, pretty flexible. And then in terms of housing type, the 2 low-income abatement programs, there's the housing type isn't determined for the nonprofit abatement, but really it's most likely to be used as part of a multifamily affordable housing development. That's where we've seen it mostly taken advantage of. And then, yeah, let's see. I think we can move on from here. I think you get the gist. All right. And obviously, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Then the last one I want to go through quickly is pre-approved plan sets for middle housing. So we've talked about this in terms of accessory dwelling units. This is also a strategy that could be used to support middle housing types. And just to kind of talk about some of the potential benefits is it really can help reduce development costs in a variety of ways by streamlining permitting processes, reducing permit fees, and then reducing design fees. So these are all things that can contribute to the cost of development, and those costs get passed on to the eventual, renter or buyer. So this could also have the potential to attract developers into the middle housing market that so far have only been developing single family housing, because it kind of creates an easy inroad. They don't need to develop their own customized designs. They can take advantage of that kind of streamlining of the process. But it's important to keep in mind that, especially in Lake Oswego, these types of template plans certainly won't work on all sites. And Lake Oswego, as you all know, has a significant topography, and often, you really need customized designs to make a development work on a site. So it might have a little bit more limited effect in Lake Oswego as maybe compared to flatter places. This could have a moderate impact on housing. It's important to note that the cost savings to builders don't necessarily translate into reduced sales prices or rents. I mean, they could have that potential, but often, sales prices are dictated by just the going market rate for housing. But it would have the potential to deliver more middle housing. So it could, just boost the production of that type of housing by just simplifying the process for getting it built. Okay, that's it. So we don't really have time for discussion right now, but I will open it up to any clarifying questions that folks have. Casey, go ahead.
Sure. Without getting into detail on these specifically, is there any way that maybe for next meeting or in the interim, you can circulate some estimates in terms of the potential revenue loss on these various tax exemptions? Again, just in terms of scale setting, because I'm sure some of these would have a broader impact than others, to Joe's earlier point. Is there any way that you could try and capture what we'd be talking about for any of these in terms of potential revenue loss for the city?
I would imagine that's a little bit more detailed than we'd be able to do in a 2-week period, at least. Typically, we would do that if we were to go out and propose a proposal to a particular tax jurisdiction. We might be able to have that analysis, but I'm not sure if that's something we can do quickly. At least in the specificity.
Even if it's not, that granular, I was just thinking, is this going to have a big impact? Is this a needle mover, or just in terms of the scale setting?
I might speak to that a little bit. This is Brendan from Johnson Economics, and we've been working with Kate and her team on this, on reviewing some of the impact for these strategies. So I would echo, I think, what the mayor said a little earlier, which is that it's probably best to think of all of these things as having a marginal impact on your housing inventory and housing types. It would be wonderful if it had a very large impact across the city in terms of creating a ton of affordable housing. But the fact is that these things move slowly and they can be challenging. And so from a revenue side, I think it's just important to remember that the amount of development activity that you might expect to find may still seem fairly marginal and isn't going to have probably a huge magnitude of impact on city revenues, for instance. Does that answer your question, or did I misinterpret?
I guess, yeah. So for example, some of the tax exemptions under the category of impact, some of those were moderate or high versus low. And I was just curious, are we talking orders of magnitude here, or is it all just de minimis?
So the magnitude of impact is really getting at an estimate of what the impact on housing production or production of affordable housing. So we were trying to get at some estimate of how effective each of these would be in increasing or facilitating additional housing production. So basically, some we feel might move the needle more than others, but even with those that we say might have high magnitude, what we really mean is that of the options available in these types of strategies, which might have the most impact on improving the developers pro forma, their bottom line, and helping projects pencil out. So that's really what the magnitude of impact means. It's for housing production and not necessarily revenues. That's another consideration that we can do, but as Erik alluded to, we'd have to talk about how much time and effort that would take to do some of those estimates.
Sure, I get it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly analyses from other cities that we could point to as like a reference point, but there's obviously unique conditions in like Oswego that wouldn't account for, but that might be some type of could be helpful, at least in context.
Cool, thanks.
Mayor
Joe?
Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. Is it not, I'm trying to recall our discussion at the council about the CET. Doesn't the school district collect a CET?
Yes, they do collect something that's technically referred to as a CET, although I think it kind of acts, I don't know, almost similar to another form of like a SEC or something like that. But yes, it's like a 1% that goes to the school, I believe.
I think that was one. Thank you, Erik, for that. I mean, and that was one consideration the council had, that we're already kind of as a community assessing a CET, on new development. I think worth noting. I will say, and I think I mentioned this at the last meeting, though. I mean, our biggest obstacle in LO is the land, right? And as has been pointed out, like there was no pot of money, except for when we had the ARPA money, which was great. We don't have that anymore. To go out, to be nimble, and to acquire land strategically that's in the right location, that would serve the community well, the future residents. And so that is a challenge. And so it is good for this group to think about these funding sources from that perspective. That we see great locations for housing developments that are near transit, that are near the town centers, near the schools, and all of that. But we are never fast enough, even using the Metro bond. I mean, it's such a bureaucratic process to get anything done. And the other challenge here we face is, it's great. I think the state is all aligned. I mean, communities, all the cities aligned in meeting these housing production goals, but we're being asked to do it without really any financial support from the state whatsoever. And LO's fortunate community, that we have a good tax base, a good permanent tax rate. Other communities are much less fortunate. And even for us, I mean, we have to meet basic needs. We have to be able to fund public safety. We have to be able to fund our roads. We have to be able to do all these things. And so we have been advocating strenuously at the state level for local funding to help support, because the state has the money. They should be doing revolving loan funds. They should be providing funding. It's very difficult for local communities to provide this money in these ways. And so, I mean, we are where we are, right? But just worth noting that a lot of these are things that impact every community throughout the state. And we really need that big bulk of resources that the state has to be nimbly deployed without a lot of bureaucratic strings, because, no offense to our state partners on this call at all, but I mean, it's just how it is. There's always so many strings, and we cannot be as nimble as we'd like. When cities had ARPA money, they spent that money really well. It didn't have strings attached to it, and they spent it in ways that really benefited their communities. And that's how we have affordable housing projects taking place right now, is because of that ARPA money. So that's all I had.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's certainly a good point. There's obviously other funding sources that we can tap into. Obviously, there's different sort of ways that can trickle down, either federal, state, metro, whatever that might be. So yeah, I think that's another thing that we, while it's not a pot of money necessarily, that public-private partnership is one way that we can at least get a little bit more of access to that, depending on who we're partnering with. Obviously, if we're partnering with a community land trust or something like that, that could look a little bit different than some other types of partnerships. But yeah, I think ultimately just want to remind folks to just kind of keep this in your mind, I suppose, in the next couple of weeks between our meetings here. And if there's any questions, considerations, anything that popped into your mind that you really want to address, please do your best to remember next time, and we can try to dig in. Again, we will remind you of these strategies, and we'll kind of be able to discuss these again in 2 weeks. But just want to kind of prepare folks that that will be the time when we'll be able to have that more kind of a little bit more of a final discussion about, are we comfortable recommending these? So just want folks to kind of be prepared to make those types of decisions a little bit more determinedly next time. But yeah, I appreciate everybody's participation, and this has been a great meeting. I think we definitely got through a good number of strategies at today's meeting, at least the recommended piece, and I think I'm confident that we'll be able to finish this discussion before the end of our next meeting. Anything that you wanted to add here, Kate?
No, yeah, just thank you for all the comments, and yeah, I look forward to talking about it more in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and hopefully folks have a little bit more time to dig in. I'm sure a lot more questions might arise with a little bit more time to review these materials. So, it's not as though the recommended strategies are going to be off the table for discussion next time. So yeah, please, let me know if you have any questions in the interim, and looking forward to continuing this discussion in 2 weeks. So that's, I guess the next step will be our next Housing Production Task Force meeting on March 1st, I believe it is. And so that will be 2 weeks from today. Shortly after that, we'll have some more kind of public outreach, not necessarily task force focused outreach, but we'll go out and be doing an open house, as well as having some materials available for public input on our website. And the sort of next sort of time with this will be discussed at the Council and Planning Commission is April 2nd, City Council Planning Commission joint meeting. So lots going on in the next month and a half or so on this project. Lots of ways to stay tuned and sort of stay involved, but I appreciate everybody's hard work on this and ability to kind of absorb this material in a very short time frame. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.